Hello, everyone. My name is Raven Diaz. I am a rising senior at Rutgers University, majoring in social work, minor in psychology. And I want to thank everyone here today for coming during your lunch break, typically, to join our Equity Within Transportation Lunch and Learn session. Today, we're going to have a short presentation dedicated talking about the issues surrounding equitable transportation, and then go into a short panel discussion, followed with a questionnaire. And here is a snippet of the agenda. So I want to talk a little bit as to why transportation access matters. Now, often when we talk about transportation access, people don't understand that it's something that's often taken for granted. It's an underestimated issue typically, not just in society, but also legislatively. Um, because often people rely on public transportation such as trains, um, and private transportation such as Ubers, to get around. And oftentimes, for individuals with disabilities who rely on public transit or paratransportation, which is a form of getting around for individuals with disabilities, that control typically disappears. For example, people who face inaccessible transit options, their days are typically run short, and they have issues such as getting to work or going to school and running errands, getting to doctor's appointments, and generally being involved in society that typically people who are non-disabled do not have to consider or deal with. For example, for individuals who take Access Link, they have to schedule their rides within 7 weeks and 7 days in advance, um, and typically face around a 30-minute bracket to where the rides can arrive. And I want individuals to imagine that if this time bracket is there out of your day, and not only that, but it does work similar to a public transit system where you have to take the rides and you pick up people and drop off people, how much time out of your day is taken out of. And this time can typically be used for work or hang out with friends, or generally being an individual that's trying to be involved in society or go about their own business. When those things are taken for granted, you're not able to face or be a part of the life that you typically would if you're non-disabled. Um, I want to dive a little bit into the ADA, which stands for the American Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, which made it illegal to discriminate based on disability. And while transportation is included in that understanding, um, what it typically does is it guarantees basic access like ramps or paratransit, as each county in New Jersey has their own form of paratransportation. It does not equate to quality or experience. Individuals with disabilities who rely on these forms of transportation often face things like broken elevators or unreliable paratransit. Long delays are typically um, a big factor in why their days are cut short. And while these transit agencies are not required to proactively fix inaccessible systems, people with disabilities are typically forced to constantly have to fight for basic accommodations. And that's not really equity. That's really a form of survival and bare necessity. And what DATA is, which stands for Disability Access to Transportation Act. It's a federal bill designed to fix the loopholes that have been presented with ADA and bring transit access into the real world. The ADA typically says that access must be provided, but doesn't really say how well. It doesn't say services have to be reliable or fast or easy to use or function. It doesn't say anything about accountability in our system. For example, if you want to file a complaint, it's usually something that you have to do on your own. If there's issues with the system, you have to do on your own. No one else is going to fight for you. And what data will require, which stands for this act, is same-day service repair transit, better maintenance of accessibility features like elevators and lifts, and public reporting transit agencies, so they don't quietly fail. And not only that, it creates a stronger complaint system so riders can report problems and actually get a response. But the problem with that is that data has repeatedly not been passed as a law. And if we do the math, um, ADA has been active for the last 35 years. So over 30 years, we have gone without legislation being passed to effectively implement equitable transportation. So it delays people from opportunities to go to doctor's appointments or attend school, build their education, vote, and even just live fully. So you guys may be wondering what is equitable transportation and what does that exactly mean? Equitable transportation doesn't mean that everyone gets the exact same thing. It means everyone gets what they need to participate equally. And while things like having a ramp or having lifts or having elevators, it should not be considered a luxury. Closed captions, for example, are not optional. And frequent service in rural areas is not a bonus. It's not something um, that should be treated as a luxury, something that is essential and necessary for individuals to not feel left out when participating in society. Equity means designing systems from the base up to work with marginalized people first. Because if a transit system works for individuals with disabilities who use a wheelchair, it will probably work for other individuals as well. That's why universal design, which is dedicated to building systems from the beginning to the top that begin with access in mind, rather than trying to fit it in later when it becomes a problem. Not only that, but also means that there's an access to information such as audio announcements. Closed captions are readily available and readable signage. So people who may have um, poor sight or have issues that affect like sensory issues, things like that, they're able to understand what's being presented in them. And not only that, but when there is no equitable transportation, whether that be frequent or on time or affordable, it's not just an issue about equity, it's an issue about safety. As you may or may not already know, there's been plenty of issues or instances where people are left behind in trains, or they're left behind on roads, or they're left behind during major crises such as the LA fires. Um, when equability is not presented, there is no accountability, and no one is steps in to take up where our transportation system lacks. So while transit can be public, it should also be fair. And equity means also independence. So people can get from point A to point B without having to rely on others and have that free will when trying to get around. When I want to talk about issues surrounding equitable transportation, there's a huge problem when it comes to addressing who exactly is being left behind. So, with that being said, when transportation systems across New Jersey often fail people with disabilities, it kind of dives into more marginalized sectors, such as people who are not only disabled, but people who come from low income families, individuals who are Black or brown, um, typically they already live in a society where public transportation was not designed with them in mind, in addition to having a disability. So not only that, individuals with disabilities are twice as likely to lack reliable transportation. And for example, like Access Link in New Jersey, these services were created to help individuals with disabilities, but in reality, they often make a life a bit more harder. You have to schedule rides days in advance, even for things you don't know will happen. And if your rider is late, or even in some cases doesn't show up, you miss your appointment or your class or your job. And that already causes a ripple effect in how you go about and function in this world. Not only that, but if you were to miss something such as a medical appointment or something along those lines, with a ride being unreliable, it can affect your health, not just physically, but also mentally, being excluded from your peers, being excluded from your family. A lot of people who with disabilities who miss out on things like work appointments and social opportunities face a lot of mental health crisis. When you can't see your friends or leave your neighborhood, as you may all remember during the pandemic, you're cut off from your community, and all that really adds up to a loss of anatomy and opportunity and even dignity. And not only that, but while these patterns do continue, it doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the people around them as well. Now, with New Jersey's transportation system and how it falls short, specifically when it comes to people with disabilities and not being able to meet their basic needs and fit to certain standards, what they typically do is slap on these quick fixers, such as Access Link. And as mentioned before, it's extremely unreliable. And a lot of these wait times and rigid schedulings don't match real world needs. For example, you may need to get to your job at 9 a.m., but you may have to start your commute at 6 a.m. despite being only 20 or 30 minutes away. And not only that, but there are infrastructural barriers like broken sidewalks and poorly placed ramps and inaccessible stations that block mobility. While New York is not New Jersey, around I believe 83% of their train stations are not fully accessible. And now that causes a ripple effect in how you're able to not only get involved initially, but later on in life, it affects how you go about in the world. This lack of readily available coverage in rural and suburban areas leaves many isolated or dependent on others. Many individual disabilities are forced to stay inside for days at a time due to the lack of access and readily able um, and equitable transportation. Um, for example, not only does it cause extra exhaustion in your life, but when a ride runs late, your whole day can easily fall apart. For example, as I said with the job, if you come in late, then you can cause issue with your boss, and then that can contribute to issues surrounding economic crisis if you're fired or you lose hours of your shift. And that also contributes to issues surrounding public transportation and how when these things don't correlate or work together, it can easily affect someone's life out of what can be what's typically considered. Not only that, but there's limited coordination between services, which creates confusion and delays. So a lot of people who are disabled, they rely on multiple forms of transportation to get from point A to point B, especially if it's a farther location. For example, they may take Access Link and then have to go across a bridge and then get on another type of ride, such as Access Ride, which is in New York. Or they would have to take Access Link, then prepare to go on the train, and then get to another part of the get to a next stop. The next stop doesn't have an accessible elevator, so then they're forced to go to the next stop to find one that is accessible. So you can easily see how the limited coordination between different services, such as paratransit, public transit, all those things between, can further contribute to inequities within our transportation system. Now, while we have called out multiple issues surrounding our transportation system, I think it's important to recognize what equitable transportation is supposed to look like. And while it is to build a system that works for everyone from the start, we need to make sure that accessibility is the standard and not the exception. So what this basically means is that equitable transportation should be flexible. Life is unpredictable. We all have friends, we all have families. Some of us may have job opportunities that we're missing out on because of the lack of equitable transportation. Um, some of us may be missing out on opportunities, missing out on social events, milestones, because our transportation system is not put in place to support this spontaneity. I think I hope I'm using that right word right. In day-to-day life, that's typically not considered. What we need to do is make sure that our systems are reliable. They arrive on time and are scheduled and work on a scheduled basis. We need to make sure there is flexibility and that universal design is embedded from the start into our vehicles, into our stations, into our sidewalks. Even in instances like taking an Uber or a Lyft, we need to make sure that we're offering um, rides that are accessible, making sure that drivers are trained to work with individuals with disabilities. And we need to make sure that the pricing is affordable and doesn't create financial hardship. For example, in New Jersey, the prices typically go up the farther you go. In New York, however, it goes similarly to a typical public transit, such as a train. How much it would cost to take the train would be the same as much as it would cost for paratransit in New York. That's something that I believe that New Jersey should also try and model. And not only that, but we should make sure that these integrated systems connect across regions and services. So we're not just offering services in one county, we're offering it in multiple counties, in multiple areas, not just from a certain distance, but from certain places. So typically, when we're talking about equity within transportation, we often kind of recognize it as an issue that pertains to an individual need. It's something that you want, something you need, and it's a luxury to have. What it really is an example of a deeper connected issue to broader movements like social justice. Because when we don't have equitable transportation overall, it's a larger issue surrounding social justice, and it affects individuals in ways outside of just what they leisurely want to do, like going to movies. Despite that also being important, it's denying people an opportunity to safety and dignity. It's denying them access to employment and education and healthcare and living a stable life And not only that, but the injustice in transportation systems, it disproportionately affects people with disabilities, people of color, and income families and low income individuals. So having a reliable transportation system is essential for independence and civic participation because that's where it starts when we try to change the system that we have now. Lack of access contributes to deeper pots of poverty and health disparity and housing instability. And true transportation equity must be intersectional and justice driven. It should not be something that's measured up as a luxury or something to do for your leisure time. It's something that's required so you can go about and live life in all facets. Now, ways that we can go about rethinking who and what our system is built for, we need to make sure that when decisions are made, we need to make sure that those decisions are made with certain voices being prioritized. It's not about just fixing a broken system, it's about redesigning with intention to have a meaningful impact. So these are some three call to actions that I think that we should do as society to move forward towards an equitable transportation system. So number one, that'll be to conduct community-led accessibility audits. What audits basically are is that you go in your community and you measure parts of where we're lacking and where we can kind of fill up those holes of where we are lacking in. And we make sure it's community-led because the community knows their issues the most. Individuals with disabilities know what they need, and that they need to be the front face voices for deciding where we're lacking, where we need to improve. We need to make sure that we're redirecting funding towards access first. Oftentimes when we talk about this conversation and where accessibility comes into it, a lot of times it's often the last thing that is considered. It's typically an afterthought. And as you can see with the systems that we have now, they're typically quick fixer uppers that don't really fix the long-term problem, which is independence and equitability. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we need to make sure that we're centering people with disabilities in these new designs. Individuals with disabilities typically are not being considered to the maximum when we are trying to implement new forms of accessibility, and making sure that the system that we have right now is equitable for everyone and it fits everyone's needs. So centering individual disabilities in this new movement is key to making sure that the system that we recreate is something that is equitable and reasonable for everyone. Thank you. So now we're going to get into the panel discussion, and I'm going to have all our panelists introduce each other. And I'm going to call on Kelly, because I see her on my screen first, to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Nolan. I am a rising junior at Rutgers University, majoring in psychology with a dual minor in disability studies and sociology. And I am very glad that you guys were all able to join, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of our discussion.
Millie, would you like to go second?
Sure, thank you so much. This is Millie. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am a disabled Hispanic plus size female. Today I'm wearing a black shirt with some bling. I have curly dark hair, and my Zoom background is kind of a modern teal geographic shape. I am, as I mentioned, a disabled advocate. I'm the board president for a national organization called the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. I'm also board chair for the Spina Bifida Resource Network, vice chair of the local Center for Independent Living, co founder of the New Jersey Disability Collective, and treasurer for the New Jersey Disability Action Committee. I think that covers it, but thank you for inviting me, Raven, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you for that introduction, Millie, and thank you all for being able to join. Danny, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Danielle Ahern. You guys can call me Danny, though. I am a social work student at Ramapo College. Um, my journey in social work and with my disability has kind of been unique in the sense that I have kind of had to switch around a little bit in terms of what universities I go to best take care of myself and my disability. I have amplified musculoskeletal pain syndrome. It's similar to fibromyalgia, complex regional pain syndrome, kind of in that family. So yeah, I'm really excited to share with you guys today and learn some more as well. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm wearing a purple polo and I have dark brown hair or light brown hair. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, for the introduction. Unfortunately, my camera is not working, but I'll describe myself. My name is Raven Diaz, and I am a non-ambulatory wheelchair user. I have dark brown skin, brown eyes. My hair is corn rolled down. I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt, and I have a head mic on. So yeah, thank you all. So we're gonna get into our panel discussion. I can also hit the questions in chat if that also would be helpful. But yeah, I'm gonna start with our first question, which is how do systemic failures in transportation affect people with disabilities beyond just inconvenience? And what should others understand about these deeper impacts?
This is Millie. I'm happy to get us started. First, I think Raven, you did a really good job of sort of preparing us for this conversation and sort of explaining the ways in which transportation failures impact people with disabilities beyond just, missing the bus, right? I think one of the things that Raven that you mentioned was the pandemic, and I think that's a good place to start because it's recent history enough, recent maybe current history because it's still impacting us in many ways. Um, the world kind of freaked out because we had to stay home and we had to isolate and we didn't have ways to get to work. Transportation shut down. Couldn't access just, medical care. Couldn't go to the doctor unless it was medically necessary. All of the things, right? So people who were not used to that didn't know what to do with themselves. And as a community, well, first of all, I could speak for myself. It was like an extension of what I was already dealing with as a disabled person. And I think the disability community felt the same way. We were used to being isolated. We were used to not having access to medical care unless somebody else decided it was medically necessary. We were used to not being able to access everyday needs, mostly because of lack of access, but we were still used to that. We are still used to that. Um, so while I'm not saying that as a community we didn't suffer in the pandemic, many lives were lost. My best friend died in the pandemic. I mean, we certainly felt the impact of it, but I think that's a good way to put into perspective sort of the ways in which we as a community exist with the lack of pleasure that so many others are used to. So, kind of just to add to what you were saying as well. So, it really, when transportation fails us, the ripple effects of that impact every single part of our lives. Um, Beyond like missing a bus, just think about on a day-to-day what that means if you miss a bus and kind of the stress that brings. But for us, that could be medical appointments, that could be not going to a job interview or not getting to work, not getting to class, things like that. Those are not minor inconveniences because they're happening all the time. They're actually major barriers that are kind of, as you mentioned again, Raven, are pushing us toward, poverty, are pushing us towards more dependency. Um, so, there's that piece. And then on another perspective, we're talking about thus far public transportation, but let's talk about for those that can drive, those individuals with disabilities that can drive, the financial burden is enormous. Like accessible vehicles like modified vans are currently, like, not with the this week changes,
Mhm.
costing over $100,000 for a modified van. That's outrageous. That's
Mhm.
outrageous. So independent transportation then becomes out of reach for many disabled people too, despite their ability to drive. So there's that piece. So I'm going to wrap up by saying, these types of transportation failures are telling disabled people that our time, our health, our employment, our education, our participation in our communities is optional and unimportant. They're reinforcing the message that our lives as disabled people are secondary. So it goes really beyond inconvenience and speaks to kind of exclusion and even beyond that kind of erasure. So,
Absolutely, Millie, and thank you for bringing up those points. Especially since you talked about a little bit how the pandemic affected you and your family specifically. When the pandemic happened for myself, I was still in high school, but there is a period of time where we had a hybrid schedule where students can come to school and stay for a few days, then come home. And I recall the readily available access to having the small vans, the small school bus vans come, was something that wasn't really feasible, and it was a just it was a really it was a long process if we wanted to go and try and see if I can go back to school. So it was a period of time where I just stayed home straight. And this was before we had the full pandemic where I had to stay home. I stayed home straight for 3 months. I didn't go outside. I didn't do anything. And over that time, that worsened my physical, not only my mental health, but also my physical health. When I remember going outside after 3 months and physically not being able to just be able to have the typical mobility that I have now that thankfully I've gained back. But just thinking about the individuals who are left behind and didn't have the support system, such as having a school or having family or anything like that. And at the time period, I was still relatively, I think, a sophomore in high school. So I had my parents, I had my guidance counselor, and even that support wasn't enough to actually be um, I guess growing into myself as a student. I had to wait all the way until my senior year before I can start getting involved. And I recall doing so many clubs, doing so many meetings because I knew for all the years that we not just missed out on the pandemic, but also just missed out as a student with disability who didn't have readily available transportation. I understood that that was going to affect me long term, especially when going and trying to pursue higher education. If all I had to represent myself was pandemic grades, because I knew that was also a stigma, that was an issue, um, then I knew I probably would not have as many opportunities as I have or had back then, at least perceiving it, to go into higher education and go to Rutgers or anything like that. I recall only applying to community college because I knew they were going to accept me regardless, and applying to Rutgers as like the best case scenario because I originally wanted to go out of state, but I knew if a pandemic happened like this again, how would I get back home? How would I work with my community to support me through my education if this were to happen again? So I completely just shift my way on how I thought about traveling and just being about and getting myself involved in the world, just like growing into a young adult. But thank you so much for sharing that, Millie. Um, yeah, so Danny, Kelly.
Hi, so I just wanted to add on, Millie, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'm so sorry to hear about your friend that passed away in the pandemic. I feel that really a huge theme here is isolation, right? And isolation from daily lives and being able to uh, live in fulfillment. I forget if it was Raven or Millie who mentioned this, but the fact that um, we as disabled people are meant to feel secondary and like our involvement is optional, right? It's just hugely isolating, and I think for our community has had a lot of negative mental health impacts, just like Amanda said in the chat. Thank you. In my own experiences, I actually attended Rutgers University for one semester, and I found it really inaccessible, to be honest, especially in terms of transportation. Now, the people who worked in transportation, I could tell had the best of intentions and were really trying their best, but it really boils down to um, systemic failures in the system, right? I had to fill out really extensive paperwork to apply for paratransit. And while my request was approved in July, I was not made aware that there was additional paperwork to be done. And so my paratransit accommodation was not approved until about week 5 or 6 of the semester that I was there out of 15 weeks. So I went a very significant portion of the semester um, unwisely hurdling myself on Rutgers buses and getting hurt, because that's really what happens with my condition. Um, just experiencing a lot of pain and a lot of isolation because of that. And, even when my paratransit was approved, I was told that this was solely and only for classes. If I had to meet with an academic advisor, I couldn't use paratransit. I was told that if there were any extracurriculars I wanted to participate in, I wouldn't be able to use paratransit either. Um, and I have spoken to people who have had other experiences where they have been able to use paratransit via Rutgers for um, extracurricular activities. So I think a lot of it has to do with inconsistency, as well as the fact that a lot of people in public transportation are extremely overworked and in many cases underpaid as well. I mean, we saw that recently with the NJ Transit strikes. Um, and yet it's really impacting disabled communities negatively, even if the people in transportation are trying their best to include us. Really, it's just the system kind of needs an overhaul, in my opinion. And I think there needs to be more legislation protecting disabled communities. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act in Title III, which deals with public accommodations, um, basically says that religious organizations and private clubs, for example, don't have to follow that they are exempt. And so again, like Millie, like you said, it makes us feel and really tells us that our involvement in society is secondary, and that has a lot of negative implications for our health, both physically and mentally.
Thank you, Danny, for that. And I definitely want to add on to, especially I'm also a record student. Me and Danny were at USPO together. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to add on to that about how paratransit is only accessible just for the purposes of class. And just applying that to this ripple effect that was mentioned earlier. Um, when you're not given the opportunity to just not just go to class, but also be involved in ways such as being a part of an e-board or going to career exploration events or anything like that, then when you graduate, you're really not gonna have anything to show besides class. Even at the and even if that's difficulty for a lot of people with paratransit. Um, so yeah, thank you, Danny, for highlighting that. Kelly?
Hello, everyone. So I don't know if I mentioned this earlier and everything, but I have what they call a sensorineural bilateral hearing loss. So this really impacts in terms of when it comes to like hearing announcements on certain transportation things. So for example, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the NJ Transit and how when they're making the announcement of the stops and everything, it usually often comes off muffled and everything, and there's no really any visual alerts. And this puts into a huge inconvenience for those with disabilities, especially in my part, because what if I'm not able to like hear that and there's no visual signal? How will I know when I have to get off, especially as someone who doesn't really do the train as often? And say like if I want to go to Secaucus or anything and I miss the stop and everything, it can really cause like an inconvenience and everything. So that's why I'm talking about like basically how this can cause like anxiety and isolation for my part, because not being able to like hear things along with being able to see exactly where you are can really put a burden for those with a disability.
Thank you, Kelly. You really highlighted an amazing point right there. And it not only just brought insight to everyone here, but it definitely brought insight to me because it just makes me think if there's an issue or there's an emergency, how's that being not just those announcements are typically fixed, right? So if there's an emergency that everyone is communicating to each other regardless of how they do it, what are they doing for individuals who may communicate a bit differently, you know? But thank you so much for asking that question and I mean answering that question. But moving on to the next question that we have, and I'm going to also put this in chat. Many transit systems claim to be ADA compliant, but what does actual accessibility look like beyond blatant compliance? And where's the gap between legal standards and lived reality?
This is Millie. I'm happy to start again unless one of the other ladies want to chime in.
You could go right ahead, Millie. I think I'm gonna think over my response a little bit more, if that's okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So this is Millie again. Thank you for putting the questions in the chat, Raven. That's helpful. So I think one of the things, ADA compliance, so Americans with Disabilities Act has been around for what, 35 years next month? And yet ADA, first of all, the Americans with Disabilities Act is the only federal legislation that requires the people who it is intended to protect to enforce the law. Okay, so there is no federal oversight on the ADA. The only way that we can get oversight of the ADA is for us to sue someone, or for us to bring it up. So that is just like one thing to think about in terms of something that is just set in place more for show than it is, you know, for being helpful. So that being said, ADA compliance is often like a box that gets checked, right? As a person with a disability, I live in the space between what's legally allowed and what's actually functional, usable, and allows me to live, my best life. For example, again, Raven brought some of these up, a lift that works some of the time, um, accessible stops, that's 3 blocks from the curb, I'm an avid concert goer, so this doesn't have to do directly with transportation, but just for putting things into perspective. I call a venue recently to say, do you have, an accessible area in your lawn section? And the response from the person on the phone is, well, we've had ADA assessments and we've been assessed as compliant. I'm like, well, what does that mean? What does it look like? And they're not able to answer the question. And they just say, we have an area. People have been able to come. Sure, on a day where there's blue skies and sunshine, I might be able to come and sit on your lawn, but if it's rained in the last 24 to 48 hours, I'll be sliding in mud on your very hilly lawn. So what does that look like, right? So it might pass inspection, but does it like fail real people and like real usage? So it's really more than meeting codes. It's about reliability, dignity, independence, being able to get to and from somewhere when and how you want to. And so compliance really means nothing. And Kelly, I appreciate you saying, what you did. I think we need to think about access in a much bigger picture. Um, you know, clear announcements for people who are blind, visual displays for deaf passengers, spaces that accommodate different types of chairs or mobility equipment that we're coming with. Beyond that, staff that understands basic disability human etiquette, um, that's genuinely helpful and not just, again, following a checklist. I've had instances where I've gotten in a bus and or a train on more than one occasion, and you know, we need to make space for a wheelchair. We need no, we need to make space for yes, a wheelchair. So I'm like, okay, you need to make space for a person who is in a wheelchair. Like those are very different things, or we have to get the wheelchair off first. Okay, if you take my wheelchair off, you're leaving me on the train. So it's just the language around disability and how that just makes us feel beyond being completely inconvenient. So I can talk a whole bit about that. But and again, information about accessibility, how do we find it? Like, is our stations accessible? Are stations working? Are elevators working? Like, how are we getting immediate information about service and accessibility, and what are our alternatives? Not just apologies like, hey, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about it. It stopped working 6 days ago. They haven't fixed it yet. Why didn't anybody say something 6 days ago? So I think just these really basic things that go beyond, like, they're just basic, like dignity. um, uh, so many things that I think could be improved and really go beyond what is ADA compliant to be disability friendly.
Thank you, Millie. That was such a meaningful insight, especially since you focused on dignity and not just like the logistics of like how reality versus expectation, um, but also just people's disabilities feelings and how they're feeling when things like this do happen. I think that's often something that goes underlooked in a way, overlooked in a way when we try to make things ADA compliant because we're not just considering a wheelchair or a cane or mobility device or anything like that. We're considering a person and how they're going about in the world. So thank you so much for that. Danny, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Millie, for sharing that. To add on just like the idea of like environment and dignity with disabled people, right? I think that um, I agree. It's really important that staff in transportation systems are given training to make sure that they are treating disabled people with dignity and respect. And I think this also goes to situations with like passengers too. For example, I've gone on buses with my cane before and I've had like kind of a hard time standing and it's been really inaccessible. Like, how can staff make sure that the space is accessible for those people as well? It really shouldn't be on disabled people to have oversight with the ADA. It's so insane to me that there is no federal oversight and that there are exemptions to the ADA as well. Um, and like we mentioned earlier, that creates a sense of isolation. For example, like I mentioned earlier, Title III with public accommodations, churches are exempt, right? So not only is this isolation physical, not only is it emotional, but for a lot of people, it's spiritual, and it's that can be really important to a lot of people. Um, and back to the oversight thing, how you mentioned that many people have to sue in order to get oversight with the ADA. Um, that is just so economically inaccessible as well. A lot of people don't have the money to invest in, lawyers or a legal case. And, that combined with the economic disadvantages and inequalities that disabled people face, it's just overall really unfair, um, inaccessible, and just not very dignifying as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Kelly, would you like to finish us off?
Okay. So for me, when it comes to ADA compliance, I kind of see it as more so like the starting point, but not so like the finish line. Because although a train, let's go back to like my example of using the NJ Transit and everything, they may like check off the boxes legally, but if they don't have like accessible, like what you call it, properties and stuff like that to help fit those with disabilities and everything to better help provide like accessible transportation. For example, one of the hearing softwares that I use is called a hearing loop, which helps me. I can open the app on my phone and I can basically program it so I can hear certain like announcements. If I'm at a Broadway show, I can basically have the audio feeding through my hearing aid so I won't have to worry about missing anything. But if for example, if the NJ Transit doesn't have that software or a certain like bus system doesn't have it, then it doesn't really make it accessible and it makes it very hard for those like myself with a hearing impairment being able to travel safely.
Thank you, Kelly. We're going to be moving on to the next question, and I'm actually going to put it in chat beforehand. But the question is, how do inaccessible transit systems shape long-term decisions like where people live, go to school, or seek work, and what are the broader consequences of that pattern?
Hi, I would be happy to start us off on this question if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So for me, this has actually been really huge in my experience. So just a little background on me. I'm a rising junior in college. I'm going to Ramapo College in the fall, and that actually is where I started. So I did my freshman year there, and I had a very good experience in terms of accessibility and the resources that they offer there. But last spring, I unfortunately had kind of an episode with my health that required that I came home for a little bit. And I wanted to continue my education, right? And the reason that I chose Rutgers initially to transfer to is really honestly just because it was closest to home. And I knew that if I had trouble with transportation and accessibility, that I would have family members to help me out on that. Many people don't have that privilege, and that I think definitely creates a barrier with disabled people in getting their education, especially. Um, for example, I think I read a statistic like 40%, and you please correct me if this is wrong, about 40% or 43% of individuals who start college with a disability end up finishing their degree. And it's not because of any defect in character with people in the disabled community. It has a lot to do with, again, these systemic inequalities, one of which being transportation. So I'm grateful to be able to return to Ramapo in the fall because my health has improved and because I have resources that are there to help me get back and forth to class and reliable, accessible buildings. But there are many universities, honestly, probably most universities, where this is not the case. Um, Honestly, speaking to my experience at Rutgers again, I definitely had a lot of trouble with accessible transportation, and that was a large part of my decision to leave the university.
Thank you, Danny, for sharing that. And again, I'm so happy you made the decision to go back to Ramabo. I hope you're able to face a better experience. I just want to add on to that with my own experience. Um, while it's not directly linked to transportation, but everything goes hand in hand, there was a period of time during my first semester, my sophomore year, where my wheelchair wasn't working right, and the only way to get to and from campus was really my dad to drive me because the way buses move, it moves really like clinky clacky, especially with me in it. It can cause more damage to it than necessary. However, obviously, I can be driven every time to class, especially since I have a relatively big family. But one of the first recommendations my professor told me to do was to drop out. Well, no, it was actually ODS. It was my ODS accommodations coordinator, and she told me to drop out and continue school in the spring semester, the spring semester. And I'm so thankful and grateful that I had family, I had my mom, I had my sister, to travel back and forth with me. And we had to take the bus, but at least if something went wrong, I had that extra support to help me, so I'm not just stranded in the middle of college campus. Um, and I was able to finish off my semester relatively well. And I also want to thank my professors for giving me the grace to um, finish my assignments at home or do things like that. So I'm just going to add to that 40% is very much real and it's still something that's very much present today. Um, Millie or Kelly?
I can continue with the next part of the discussion.
Mhm.
So for me, I've had to plan like major like life decisions depending on how I would be able to get to and from class, especially being a freshman. And if you guys are familiar with the Rutgers bus system, there is a lot of buses, and oftentimes they don't give you the knowledge or the resources of how to navigate these buses, more so which buses go to which campuses. And because oftentimes most buses don't make the announcements of what stops they're getting off on, or more so the visual signals that they have often don't display the correct date or time nor the location that it's going, can be very frustrating. And it also impacts me heavily on if I'm going to be able to make it to class on time, or although just altogether just being able to just get somewhere safely and knowing that I'm there in a timely manner.
Thank you, Danny and Kelly. This is Millie. I don't have too much to add here. I think you've both really outlined a lot of the issues that we as a community are facing because of this, and what that does to our long-term kind of decisions. um, One point, I guess, of reference, we talked a little bit about Access Link, which is the paratransit system here in New Jersey, um, which again requires advanced notification and planning to even plan a pickup and a drop off. Um, there's no flexibility in that. For example, pickups and drop offs can only be within 3/4 of a mile of an existing New Jersey Transit station, bus or train station. Um, and transport paratransit access link is only available during the same days and hours as the regularly scheduled local fixed route bus service. That includes weekends, that includes holidays, everything else. So what does that mean? That means most of us are not able to get to anything on the weekends or on holidays. So family reunions, family, Christmas or holidays, none of it. Like we can't go because transportation systems typically don't run at those times. So we are again left out of just life, like I think that's my major thing. Like, yes, major life choices, where we live, where we work, when and we can leave the house. Like, has nothing to do with what I want or what's best for me or what I need. It's on what's reachable, what's possible by the unreliable paratransit system and the sort of inaccessible public transportation system. And that's just not freedom, it's really about survival. Um, and again, it just continues to kind of lock us into cycles of dependence and um, limiting our opportunities that are already incredibly scarce, and really hampering our ability to succeed and thrive, and plan even for the future. So, thank you.
My mic wasn't working before, but I want to thank also Kelly for her insight. But thank you so much, Millie, for mentioning that. Um, Honestly, just going back to ripple effect, I know it's been said like 30 times by now. But it truly is. And if you're not given opportunities to get around, you're not getting an opportunity to get a job or a promotion. And a huge part as to why I quit my first job, despite just facing advert pads of all forms of ableism that I didn't even know there was a name for at the time. Besides that, outside that, a huge part of why I decided not to work there anymore is because of me navigating Access Link and just getting there a half an hour before, an hour before, 2 hours late. It was a horrible situation to be a part, especially when you're relying on um your employment to pay for your basic necessities. But yeah, we're going to move on to our fourth question. And our fourth question is transportation equity often focuses on physical access, but what about the social and psychological barriers people with disabilities face in using transit? How can systems address stigma, safety concerns, and feelings of exclusion to create truly welcoming transit environments? I'm also going to put that question in the chat.
So I would honestly love to start this discussion up with this question, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So for me personally, I know it has definitely put a toll on my mental health, especially because when I per se miss an instruction or I don't know what's going on, I've had people tend to get annoyed at me when I didn't respond to these like specific announcements. For example, if it was like an emergency or people are conversing about like what to do and I can't quite understand them. I was being treated as I was ignoring instructions, or in reality, I was just asking for clarity. And such reactions can cause shame for myself because it also discourages me from being able to even use public transportation because having seen the chain reaction of people being like, oh, well, like she didn't quite understand that because she was just ignoring it or she wasn't paying attention. Oh, she was probably on her phone or something. But in reality, I just needed overall clarity to help make sure I can better suit and be able to ride this safely.
Thank you, Kelly. Would Millie or Danny like to go next?
Yeah, sure. To add on to kind of what Kelly said, I think there's definitely social barriers that people with disabilities face in using the transit or even in their inability to use the transit. I found in my experience at Rutgers with the busing systems, if I wasn't able to get on a Rutgers bus, I often wasn't able to attend a lot of the activities that um, I was involved in. And, that honestly at times made me really like worried and stressed out because, I was an executive board officer for the undergraduate social work organization at Rutgers. And, I had a lot of friends in our crochet club, Stitch for Life, but I found that a lot of people just didn't really understand why I couldn't utilize that transportation just because my disability is not always so visible. So I think a lot of this has to do with sensitivity training for people who work in the transits and also people who um, are involved in administration with that. So I think in terms of physical access, I think physical access can promote social access, and I think there are ways to improve that, such as specific seating for people who have disabilities. But in general, I think there is a lot of stigma for people who try to access these systems, kind of like Kelly mentioned. We're often seen as not wanting to go with the flow or the crowd, whereas that's really not the truth.
Yeah, and also to add on that, Danny, I think there's some sort of burdensome notion or social bubble that people with disabilities are typically kind of ingrained into. I know for myself, when trying to take the New Jersey buses, not paratrans or anything like that, there's multiple times where the lift isn't working, and I get side glances from people who are already on the bus trying to get to work, and you can't help but think, oh, is am I the problem? But you don't want to interrupt their day, but your day isn't being interrupted as well. So while there's already a systematic barrier in place, it's kind of influencing how people perceive us socially. Because if there's a notion like, oh, this person, rather than the ramp is not working for this individual with disability, so we can continue on our day, it's this person with a disability is interrupting our day because they have to use the ramp. So I just think, just adding on to that, how um, systemic barriers kind of are intertwined with how we're socially perceived and all the stigma behind it. So thank you for bringing that up. Millie, would you like to finish us off?
Sure, thank you so much. This is Millie. I agree again with Kelly and Danny and Raven. I mean, all really, really, really important points and things I've also experienced, including my example from earlier. Um, we I'm a full-time wheelchair user, so like I'm not just navigating the ramps and the curb cuts, right? Like that's not all I need. Like all of you have said, we're navigating judgment, fear kind of the unknown, right? Just people not people fearing what they don't know and fearing like, you can't catch my disability. It's physical and it's developmental. You're not going to catch it by being nice to me. Like literally people just not understanding, right? What they're what other people are experiencing. And then also just the invisibility of disability, meaning like people view disability as a bad word, right? If people see you or if you identify as somebody with a disability, you often get like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be sorry for me. Make Help me make the world accessible, right? Because if I woke up tomorrow and I knew how to walk, I wouldn't know what to do with myself. Like, don't do that to me because we're going to have to start all over. This is the body I know. What I do need is to be able to access, the places and the systems and the supports that I need in an accessible way. Um, so I don't know. So, I'm going to say one other example is that like I've gone to train stops, New Jersey Transit train stops, and trains have come. I have, waved down the conductors and said, I'm getting on, I'm going to New York. They see me, they kind of look at one another, and into the train they go, and they leave me on the platform waiting for the train. Has happened on more than one occasion. Um, So I've been ignored by not just other passengers. I've been ignored by transit workers. Um, I mean, forget the stared at and all the other things. Like, what I'm probably double the age of all the other panelists. So I've had double the years of all the things that we're all experiencing. I'd love to tell you it goes away. It doesn't, but I will tell you, you care less when you get older. Stare away. Um, so these aren't like technical issues. These aren't accessibility issues. These are like cultural issues. These are social issues. So I think a welcoming transit system needs to be me feeling safe for asking for help without being treated like I'm a burden, exactly what Raven was talking about. Me being able to expect that the accessibility features that will help me get it on or off transportation systems are working, and that that's an okay thing to expect, right? It means drivers are trained, that riders are respectful, and the system sees us as people with disabilities as people, not problems, right? Because access without feeling like you belong is really not enough. Um, so I think that's one thing. And I mean, I guess we'll talk a little bit about what that change looks like, but I think it comes into maybe um, in addition to comprehensive staff training, really having public education campaigns and policies that protect, against harassment in a real way. Uh, Um, and to Kelly's point, maybe lastly, and also maybe most importantly, that really take us into consideration in moments of emergency um, response. Um, well, preparedness, response, and recovery when it comes to transportation as well. So I think those are all things that really need to be factored in.
Thank you, Millie, for your insight. And honestly, we're people, not problems. I think that's something that honestly needs to be highlighted every single day. Because I think everyone agrees it's completely unacceptable that you're getting left behind at train stations. I even know for myself, I'm apprehensive to taking the train because I'm afraid of being left behind. And then all the places and all the things that come with being on a train, it's something that's often not ideal, especially since it is a small place with a lot of people, not a lot of space, and a lot of times you're either left behind or forgotten or just not a priority because there is so many people. And it's unfortunate to think that something that is ignorant or something that is bad is just going to happen. It's something that's, I think, innate in our system, just as social wise, and I think that definitely be changed if we can definitely implement policy re enhancement. I hope I'm using the right word right. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And we're gonna be ending off our panel with this last question. I'm gonna be putting it in chat. And that is, what's one actionable change, big or small, that you want attendees to advocate for, implement, or demand when they leave this panel?
I'll start us off and everything if that's okay. So I basically said for me and stuff like that, I had like my little notes and everything. And I said mainly for pushing real-time visual alerts that matches audio announcements, whether that be on platform, buses, for apps, everywhere. This would basically be one change that would make a massive difference for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And honestly, it would probably help everyone. It's clear, it's accessible. Communication should be the norm and not an exception.
Absolutely, Kelly. Thank you for that. Millie or Danny?
I think for me personally, ADA oversight I think is exceptionally important. And I think that people should be advocating for more legislation to ensure that there's oversight for policies like the ADA. Um, Ramps and elevators, etc., should be accessible. This should not be an exception, kind of like Kelly mentioned about the messages of the train. And in general, when these systems do fail, we as a society need to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Danny.
This is Millie. I use way more words than both of you. I apologize. Um, I think so. There's a slogan, I can't think of the right word, in disability justice community that is nothing about us without us. And I think that we really need to push for nothing about us without us in practice and not just in principle, right? So insist that disabled people are not just consulted, but we're leading in these different places. You know, every meeting, every plan, every route change should have our voices at the table from the start. If you're building a system for us without us, you're building it wrong, right? So I think in every scenario, real change starts with shifting power. So give us the mic, give us the seat or the space to pull up our own, and then the authority to kind of drive the conversation forward and to make that change. That being said, and wait, that let me add one thing that I think is really important. Don't just call in a favor. You know, don't just ask us for our opinion or ask us how things work for us. Hire us, pay us to be part of your team because we're as valuable an expert as any scientist, engineer, or any other consultant that you would bring in to your organization. We are just as valuable, and our expertise is just as valuable as any one of those. That being said, we're not always invited to the table. You might not have you yourself may not have the power to invite us to the table. So I guess the one thing that I really would ask is that to become an ally for people with disabilities. You know, if you are one who already has a seat at the table, if your voices are already being more readily heard than those of us with disabilities, then I ask for you to speak up. You ask the hard questions about accessibility. Refuse to let projects move forward without like meaningful input about how does this work or not for people with disabilities? How are people with disabilities being left out of this conversation or this project or this system, right? This program. And kind of in a bigger scale, you know, support disability in any way that you can. I'm going to say right now we need disabled candidates for elected positions, you know, that oversee things like transportation funding and policy. Um, Again, real change will not happen unless there's a shift in power. And I think that we really need to be included in those spaces where we currently are not in a very big way. And making sure that if you do have some power to give us authority and resources to make meaningful improvement, that you do make that happen.
Thank you, Millie. That was just a well thought out answer. And I was going to respond to the question. I was going to say something simple like even platform trains. That's what I was initially thinking about. But just being able to address all the systematic and social barriers in just um, a few short sentences, I think that's just an amazing thing to say. And I think we all can take something away from that. Um, but yeah, that's basically going to close out our panel. Thank you, Danny, Millie, and Kelly. You guys had amazing answers and amazing insight. I'm sure everyone here is going to leave today with at least one or two things learned and that they're going to practice. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. So you guys can put it in the chat or raise your hand.
This is Millie. It looks like we have a question in the chat. What are some things that workplaces can do to be more inclusive for people with disabilities?
I think one thing that workplaces can do to be more inclusive with disabilities is definitely try and kind of understand their needs and kind of work about it in a way that is kind of works for everyone, especially with the person with disability, for that to be actually implemented. I recently started a new job, and one of the things they asked me to go was to come to the working site and go through what my day-to-day tasks would be and kind of measure the level of accessibility and what they can do to make it more accessible. And while they're currently still working on that, it was something that was definitely needed. They asked me to comment. I was centered in the conversation. My needs were centered and prioritized. I was never told that my needs were too much. Um, I was never told that my needs were things that they couldn't exactly do, at least without compensating within a different way. And yeah, just similar to what Millie said, just centering our voices, centering our needs, and not downplaying what we do need, and not downplaying us as kind of like a pity hire or something along those lines. We are qualified, we are capable, and I think given the opportunity to showcase our skills is just the only way to give us the opportunity to showcase our skills in a way that may be similar or even better than our non-disabled peers is simply by offering those accommodations. So the question, I would say like the question, well, I wouldn't say the answer to the question is accessibility or equitability. I think the question is accessibility or equitability, and I think the answer to that is immediately yes. I think that's what's going to really enforce a positive and equitable and fair workspace.
I'm happy to add on if that's okay.
Yeah, of course,
I
everyone
think
can
in
answer.
addition to that, we need to really we should definitely make sure, like in our workplaces, that resources are, like you said, centralized, that it's not difficult for employees to find the resources when they need them. So, for example, I previously was at a job where I needed to request a short medical leave because of symptoms from my condition. And it was really honestly kind of difficult to find these resources. It was difficult to get a hold of my HR representative. And when I did get the paperwork, it was like 30 pages long. Um, and so I think that for disabled individuals who need these accommodations, again, it shouldn't be an undue burden to get what we need.
Thank you, Danny. I don't know if Millie or Kelly want to add on to that answer, but now that you said it, made me remind me of my own experience because I worked at Whole Foods for like a month during the winter break just to get some extra pocket money. And when I got hired, I thought I was gonna be the shopping, but actually I was supposed to do the bagging. So everyone came, I had to bag their stuff. And not only that, when I needed accommodations, they had me go through a whole process. And I know I'm about to be 21, I'm pretty lazy, but I still go to my pediatrician. And when I was going to run around, I had to go to my pediatrician. And even when I went to go see her, she waited until I was in the office to tell me that she couldn't do the paperwork. I would need to come another time. So not only was that wasting money to actually get to the appointment, but wasting money on copay and all those things just to be told, oh, that's not going to work for one job that initially was just going to be shopping, which I was hired for. So just doing the runaround for things like that, I think that's something that's often not considered when trying to process accommodation request. Um, yeah, in the workforce.
So this is Millie. Again, Danny, Raven, both really good insights, and I agree. I think I'm going to come full circle and talk about the pandemic again and say that the pandemic taught the rest of the world, the seemingly non-disabled or non-disability identifying world, um, just a sample of what's possible to make work possible for us. I think working from home was a game changer in the pandemic. It allowed many more people with disabilities to work and to make a living because, in large part, due to transportation barriers, right? We didn't have to deal with them during the pandemic because we were working remotely. So I think thinking about the ways in which, as employers, you can um, sort of modify, you're not modifying expectations, you're modifying the ways in which your employees can succeed and thrive in your organizations by, like Danny said, giving them the resources and the supports that they need to be able to accomplish the goals and the expectations that you have for them. I do not think we are any less capable of being good employees. I think what we are less capable of doing is being really great employees when we're confined to the ways in which people think jobs should be getting done. So that would be one of the ways that I think that we could be supportive of employees.
Thank you, Millie. Um, we did see a hand raised. I don't know if Amanda Chirelli would like to speak or if that was a mistake.
You should be allowed to unmute, Amanda.
Hi, I'm sorry, it took me a little bit to get unmuted. I wanted to ask a question, but I also wanted to thank you for this presentation. I am also a person that identifies with a disability, so I do know the hurdles that you are facing with transportation. I often face them every day. In my line of work, I also work remotely, so that brought up a good point by Millie. Thank you for saying that. But I have talked to a lot of legislators about transportation and have really felt that it has gone nowhere. I feel we are dealing with a lot with the population, with Medicaid cuts possibly and things coming down the pike. I wanted to know, as you guys, as panelists, are you doing anything with legislators with transportation? And do you think that if these Medicaid cuts do happen, are you fearful of that? Do you think there's going to be a major change with a lot of this stuff? So, I guess my main question is, have you dealt with legislators with transportation, and what do you feel is going to happen if something happens with Medicaid?
Thank you, Amanda. I'm first gonna give it to the panelists and see if they want to answer.
This is Millie. A quick response is yes. I've worked with lots of legislators on lots of issues, transportation being one of them. We didn't even touch on airplanes, but one of the things that I've worked on in terms of transportation is the Air Carriers Access Act, and some of the changes that were done there. And also, as part of the team and advocates who have been advocating for years um, for the inclusion of, or the ability for people with disabilities to ride on airplanes from their seat, their chairs, their, manual or power chairs, as opposed to having to transfer, to eliminate some of the safety issues and things that are, that go along with that. So again, airplane access can be an entirely like other lunch and learn, but that is one of the things that I personally have worked on. And again, a very excuse me, brief answer to the second question. Am I concerned about Medicaid cuts? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. I myself have not worked directly with any sort of legislature. Um, however, I'm currently an intern at the Ford Foundation for the U.S. Disabilities Rights Team. And this has been my first week, but I hope during the summer I'm given the opportunity to get more hands-on on disability rights advocacy and play my part in trying to establish more rights and more of an equitable future and livelihood for individuals with disabilities. I recently connected with someone from ACLU, Alabama, like a day or two ago, and I'm going to follow up on that and see if there's any way that I can support any initiative towards implementing more equity within the lives of individuals with disabilities. Oh, also add on to Medicaid. Sorry, brain just had to load up right there. Um, but yeah, I definitely am fearful when it comes to cuts of Medicaid. I've been very privileged and grateful to still be on my parents' insurance. I am still a Medicaid recipient. However, I have dual insurance to say the very least. I think that's what it's called. I'm not sure. So I know if Medicaid is cut, I still will have some sort of medical security. But I know a lot of individuals do not. And once I age out of being on my parents' insurance, Medicaid will probably be at least the first insurance that I have, to meet my medical needs. So yeah, it's definitely something that's fearful. And I think a lot of people are experiencing the brunt effects of it right now. I think a lot of people are not, because Medicaid cuts don't just affect individual disabilities, it affects everyone. And if someone is able or to grow old enough, everyone becomes disabled. Everyone experience some sort of medical issue, and a lot of people do not have medical insurance. A lot of people don't have care or anyone to come care for them if something does go wrong. We all are really a second away from experiencing some sort of loss. Um, and I think that needs to be pushed a lot more. I think we need to fight more for Medicaid. And yeah, I think the culture surrounding Medicaid and the how people socially view Medicaid, I think it needs to I think people need to understand that Medicaid affects everyone and it could benefit everyone, and without it, it can definitely disenfranchise multiple marginalized communities. So thank you for asking that question.
This is Millie. I'm just going to add one thing on the Medicaid thing. I am not a Medicaid recipient, but yet Medicaid cuts are incredibly scary. So I just want, yes, I'm agreeing with you, Raven, that Medicaid cuts impact us kind of across the board, whether or not you're currently relying on them.
Mhm.
It will absolutely affect those that we know and absolutely affect the disability community.
Yeah.
And an unrelated note, I'm putting in the chat a short film called The Commute. It's 3.5 minutes long, not to be watched right now, but save it for when we leave here. It's a short film by a friend of mine in New York City, who did a film, a very powerful film on, transportation and lack of access, because it's like think it's like 23% of subways in New York City are accessible, and that is when they're all working, which is practically never. So that's a short film that kind of touches on this topic.
Thank you for sharing that, Millie. I will definitely check that out. Let me actually just copy and paste that link. Um, but yeah, that will pretty much be the end of our discussion unless anyone has any more questions. They can either put in the chat or raise their hand.
This is Millie again. I just want to give a shout out to Raven, who's got a internship with the Ford Foundation, because that's kind of amazing. And
Thank you.
we'll be seeing way more of Raven in the future. So I'm excited about all that will happen coming up with you.
Thank you. And I would just have to thank all of you guys here. Thank you, Millie. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Danny. You guys, this whole conversation would not have been a thing without you guys. And I think a lot of people think that individuals with disabilities kind of know everything about disability rights and all that stuff. Um, Maybe I'm talking for myself, but I feel like I gain a lot of insight from everyone here. I think we all have different abilities. I think we all have different needs. I think we have all different talents. And like I said, I am just an individual person and I only can talk from my own experience, but I think others' experience are supposed to be valued and uplifted um, a lot more. So thank you all to my panelists. Thank you all to our attendees. I hope this conversation was valuable. I hope you can carry on these lessons and the wise words here said in your day-to-day lives. And like Millie said, and also like the question that was brought beforehand, we are going to go on and do our own projects and work in our own respective fields, but just keeping disabled people in mind when trying to establish more of an equitable future, or regardless of what we're doing, regardless of what's a project or an act we're supporting or a bill or working with someone who may have more power in this monopoly of life. We just need to make sure that we're highlighting the voices that typically are not highlighted. So thank you all.